This video has been made possible thanks to Conflict of Nations, a video game designed for those of us who like to spend some time speculating on the defensive capabilities of different countries without having to harm anyone. I mention this because, unfortunately, over the last few weeks, we have all witnessed the painful images of destruction coming to us from Ukraine. We are following the atrocities of an actual war in real time. We wish Vladimir Putin had devoted his free time to Conflict of Nations and not to destroying the lives of so many people, because serious problems arise when people cannot distinguish reality from a video game or a chessboard, when they confuse passion and adrenaline with revenge and hatred. Instead, Conflict of Nations allows players to play out their hypothetical military strategies in a real-time tactical combat game, where you can choose which country you want to lead in a modern global war scenario, and engage in combat with up to 128 other players in real time, in games that can take weeks to complete. Once you have an account, you can play on PC or mobile. It's ideal for a little escape after a hard day of work or study, and for disconnecting the mind. And now, the best of all, if you click on the link in the description, you can unlock your exclusive gift of 13,000 units of gold and get 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so check it out today. Let's be honest, the atrocious and vile invasion of Ukraine was quite a surprise to the vast majority of analysts, experts, and journalists in both the military field and international politics. And in some ways, we are no exception. The truth is that a full-scale invasion seemed unthinkable. A military intervention like this, with fronts, the shelling of cities, and troops deployed throughout Ukraine, did not seem a feasible scenario. Basically because no one expected Vladimir Putin to shoot himself in the foot like this. The invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing international sanctions have put the Russian economy on the ropes and cut it off from the rest of the world. Becoming an aggressor, nation par excellence, has been one of the most absurd decisions in international memory. In Ukraine, Russia had nothing to gain but a lot to lose. And it is not just the sanctions or the military casualties suffered. Russia's invasion has also united NATO, strengthened the Atlantic Axis, and encouraged Europeans to spend more on rebuilding their armed forces. The war in Ukraine has triggered something like a journey back in time. Suddenly, the Cold War seems to have returned.
Putin puts nuclear deterrent forces on high alert amid spiraling tensions over Ukraine.
And so the blunt truth is this: Russia may be an impoverished, isolated, and corrupt country, but it is still one of the great nuclear powers. In quantitative terms, we are talking about nothing less than the largest nuclear power on the planet. That's why we wanted to answer a few questions in this video. What exactly does nuclear deterrence consist of? And how does it play a part in Moscow's plans? In which scenarios is Russia planning to use nuclear weapons? Could they ever be used on a Ukrainian battlefield? Also, we will tell you why nuclear weapons can no longer protect Putin. Let's get started. As far back in time as 1949, the Soviet Union succeeded in exploding an atomic bomb for the first time. The nuclear era of the communist bloc had begun. From then on, one of the major obsessions of the Soviet bigwigs was to build up more and more of their nuclear arsenal. To give you an idea, it is estimated that the Soviets had accumulated about 45,000 nuclear warheads just before the Soviet Empire collapsed. Initially, the nuclear doctrine of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics pursued two objectives at the same time: a political goal and a military goal. From a political perspective, the USSR's nuclear arsenal was intended to multiply the country's international influence. After all, no other state was capable of going head-to-head with the United States. On the other hand, from the military perspective, the Soviets' idea was to have their regime prevail in the event of a war that might eventually result in a US nuclear attack. And so, the Soviets were convinced that having more nuclear weapons than the Americans would give them the ultimate victory in a large-scale conflict. However, things got so out of hand that in the 1960s, for the first time, the two powers recognized the term MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction, and with it, victory ceased to be an objective and gave way to deterrence. No bloc could ever win such a war. Precisely for this reason, just a few years later, the two powers signed their first agreement to limit strategic weapons and ballistic missile capabilities. But that is all in the past. It has been more than 30 years since the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and it was the current Russian Federation who, by agreement of all parties, ended up keeping all the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Empire. And although the terrifying nuclear arsenal has been dwindling ever since, the Russian bear still has approximately 6,400 nuclear warheads, if we take into account the warheads currently deployed, those in reserve, and those in the process of being dismantled in the near future. A number, 6,400 nuclear warheads, which, although far from the historical peak reached by the Soviet Union, still makes Russia the largest nuclear power on the planet by number of warheads. Check it out. So with this in mind, the first question I'm sure many of us are wondering is, what plans does Russia have for these weapons? How and in what scenarios does it plan to use them? Listen up.
Russia's nuclear ambition.
No matter how many tyrants are at the helm, even in war, there are usually rules, especially when we're talking about an arsenal as destructive as nuclear weapons. And of course, Russia is no exception. Military doctrine is the set of principles that determine the hypothetical cases and types of military actions that order the actions of an army depending on the circumstances. Well, the latest Russian military doctrine dates back to 2014. But in June 2020, the Russian government approved a new document entitled Basic Principles of State Policy of the Russian Federation on Nuclear Defense. This document updated the threats and circumstances under which Russia can consider using nuclear weapons. And the question is, at which point does this doctrine say that Russia could use its huge, terrifying, and annihilating arsenal of atomic bombs? That is the question. In theory, Moscow considers nuclear weapons to be exclusively a means of deterrence. But of course, the key is knowing what exactly the term deterrence means in Vladimir Putin's Russia. Well, firstly, according to the doctrine in force, Russia would launch a nuclear attack in response to another nuclear attack, or other types of weapons of mass destruction used against Russia or its allies. Secondly, they would also resort to using them if they had credible data of the imminent launch of ballistic missiles against Russia or its allies, or in response to an attack with conventional weapons on critical government or military sites in Russia. Thirdly, and lastly, and very importantly, the Russian doctrine provides for the use of nuclear weapons in the event that a conventional conflict could endanger the existence of the state itself. In these cases, the preference would always be to use nuclear weapons against large military targets, such as airfields or large naval bases, which would ensure great destruction in the enemy ranks with a single strike. Well, these are the cases in which the Russian Federation would consider using its nuclear warheads. But of course, at this point, the question many of you may be asking is, let's see, Josh, everything you were telling me is pretty subjective. What would happen if NATO were to defend Ukraine or intervene militarily in Belarus? Would Putin get to use any of those weapons if the war is going badly for him? In principle, we all take it for granted that nuclear weapons exist not to be used. But the truth is that they have already been used, and that if Vladimir Putin has proven to be anything, it's unpredictable. The Russian president likes to play hardball. In fact, one of the first things Putin did when he came to power was to approve a new military doctrine that expanded the scenarios in which Russia could use its nuclear weapons. For example, it included, as a possible case, the scenario of a regional war, instead of the assumption of global war that was previously in force. Also, and this is very important, it included the possibility of using nuclear weapons in the first instance, and not only in response to an enemy attack. Western military intelligence and analysis services even suggest that the Russian High Command could consider using these weapons to de-escalate a conventional war against NATO that Russia is losing. This is known as the escalate to de-escalate strategy. I attack first, destroy, and then negotiate if the opposing side does not want to fall into mutual destruction. This is something, however, that the Russians strongly deny.
The expert community has long insisted that this document be published so that we would not be accused of maintaining doctrines imagined by the Americans, such as, for example, escalation for de-escalation. That is, claiming to use nuclear weapons to achieve victory in the conventional conflict. Viktor Eskin, former chief of the General Staff and Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Strategic Missile Forces.
What is certain is that, as Russia has fallen further and further behind economically and technologically, the prominence and importance of nuclear deterrence has become more and more central to the Kremlin's security strategy. After all, for all practical purposes, it is much less expensive to have up-to-date nuclear weapons and delivery devices than to have huge military equipment endowments such as large naval or air fleets. I think with the invasion of Ukraine, we have all been able to see the enormous shortcomings the Russian military has. In other words, if it were not for nuclear weapons, Russia would not even be considered a superpower. That is why for Moscow, and particularly for Vladimir Putin, it is essential that nuclear power is very present in his political discourse. And this is precisely what explains news stories like the one we saw previously. Do you remember it?
Putin puts nuclear deterrent forces on high alert amid spiraling tensions over Ukraine.
Or news headlines like this.
Russia launches hypersonic missiles and nuclear drills to show strength during tensions with Ukraine.
It is not that the Russian president is seriously thinking of launching himself into mass destruction, but because he knows that this is really his only trump card in trying to gain international influence, understanding that helps put such rhetoric into perspective. In principle, the military doctrine in force in Russia does not allow the use of nuclear weapons, even if a conventional war confrontation were to occur in Ukraine between the Russian army and NATO troops. In fact, it is not Russia's nuclear arsenal per se that generates the most fear, but the lack of restraint and prudence that its leader demonstrates time and again. But now we understand the situations when Russia might use its nuclear weapons and why, in one way or another, they tend to feature so prominently in Russia's rhetoric. The question is, what exactly are Russia's nuclear capabilities? Well, let's take a look.
Mutual assured destruction.
3 words as expressive as they are terrible that marked the Cold War, and that Putin now seems to be determined to bring back. However, the nuclear arsenals of the two great powers have undergone many changes and cutbacks in recent decades, largely thanks to the agreements reached by Russia and the United States. The latest of these agreements is New START, signed in 2010 between the administrations of Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev. This agreement was due to expire in February 2021, but 2 days before it was due to expire, Biden and Putin agreed to extend it in extremis for 5 more years until February 2026. Now, why is this important and what does this agreement consist of? Well, basically, New START limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons that each country can have at a maximum of 1,550, with 700 ballistic systems between land, sea, and air. Russia's nuclear-capable strategic forces consist of intercontinental ballistic missiles, 10 nuclear-capable submarines of the Delta, Typhoon, and Boris classes, and between 60 and 70 heavy bomber aircraft. Russia is currently believed to have some 310 intercontinental missiles spread across 11 bases distributed throughout Russia. These missiles, mostly of the Multiple Independently Targetable Re-entry, or MIRV type, are capable of carrying up to 1,189 nuclear warheads, although only about 800 are deployed for use. Russia is currently in the process of modernizing its strategic weapons, and it is expected that by 2022, it could have replaced all of its Soviet-era missiles. In addition, it is also believed that Russia could have in service the first Avangard missiles, which is the first Russian hypersonic ballistic system capable, in theory, of evading conventional anti-missile shields. This technology, which the United States also has, looks like the future of nuclear deterrence, which is why countries like North Korea are also trying to develop them. Be that as it may, the fact is that in December 2020, Putin said that by early 2022, around 88% of its strategic nuclear forces would be modernized. Well, we've already reached that date. That's supposed to be the case right now. Of course, we have also endured years of propaganda about the intense modernization of the Russian army, which later proved to be exaggerated when it came to the moment of truth. In the end, resources are what they are, and in Russia, economic abundance is not a national feature. As it stands, it is clear that the more than 6,000 nuclear warheads that Russia still maintains are Putin's great shield. The insurance that allows him to bet big on foreign policy while maintaining damage control, at least militarily. Because it seems that economic warfare and international isolation were never threats taken into account by the Kremlin. In the wake of their invasion of Ukraine, that could be their big mistake. But at this point, there is one last question we have to answer. Are so many nuclear warheads really necessary to ensure deterrence? Well, actually, no. According to US research, 100 nuclear warheads would be enough for a country to endure, even in the worst case scenario, nuclear deterrence. Incidentally, this same study, piloted by a professor at Michigan Technological University, concludes that it would be sufficient in terms of deterrence to establish a maximum of 900 nuclear warheads among the 9 states that today have this military technology. 900. Do you know how many warheads there are in the world today? Well, approximately 15,000. It seems that Putin has always seen nuclear weapons as Russia's shield. However, the Ukraine crisis has shown that this was a mistake. In a past video, we told you how Western allies are trying to damage, erode, even destroy Russia's economic capacity. In the face of such an attack that could end up taking Putin's own regime by storm, nuclear weapons are completely ineffective. Putin wanted to take us back to the dark days of the Cold War, but what can I say? Times have changed. And that is why, on this occasion, just as happened in Chernobyl with the famous AZ-5 button, nuclear weapons can no longer protect Russia. Once again, Moscow's mistakes in Ukraine may end up taking the ruling regime by storm. Unfortunately, once again, Ukrainians will suffer the consequences more than anyone else. Having said that, it's your turn. Do you think Putin would be capable of using atomic weapons in response to a NATO intervention in a Russian invasion of a country like Ukraine? Leave us your comments below. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Remember that if you want to escape after a hard day of work or study and switch off your mind, the free online PvP strategy game, Conflict of Nations, is worth checking out. Choose your country, design your strategy, and fight your way to victory. Click on the link in the description to get your unique starter pack. But remember that this offer is only available for 30 days. All the best, I'll see you next time.